30 seconds ago, so see how this goes. So I'm going to talk to you a bit about this thing that we did called Good Lab, but I guess mainly about why that's changed us and why we're so interested in startups and why we think that's quite an interesting thing for the charity sector. Because I think at the moment, the charity sector and startups kind of don't really go together in the same way that other corporates and startups work together, which is quite an interesting question as to why that doesn't happen and what could happen if that did work together. So take a big step back, like 3.5 years ago, Kevin, my co-founder, and I, we kind of had this idea about what if we tried to create a bit of a step change in how the sector looks at how it generates income. So a lot of the work that we were doing beforehand was creating new fundraising methods, new regular giving products. A lot of innovation in the sector is new kind of regular giving products, new events, like new ways to kind of like tap into grants. And it's all kind of perpetuating the same model. It's all kind of like tweaks on the same way of thinking. And all the trends that we see about corporates coming in and potentially disintermediating the sector, like younger people wanting to engage differently. So we were like, how do we create new ways for the sector to generate income? So we set ourselves a crazy target of coming up with 250 million in new income for the sector a year, because it just seemed like a nice big number at the time. People have asked repeatedly how we came up with that number, and just made it up. And that then was a 3.5-year roller coaster, which quite frankly aged me. I aged quite a lot of people, I think. But it did really change us, and it changed our clients too. Like we've had people that work with us in Good Lab say that they are now doing things to change their charities in a way that they never would have even thought of kind of like 3 years ago. And that to me is amazing. That to me is the point of all this. And that's kind of part of the message that I want to share and that we're really trying to get out there in terms of actually what is this and what's some of this different. So what changed? So we've written a report. It's on our website if you want to look at it. I don't have enough copies to give out because it's surprisingly expensive to print colour booklets on thick-looking paper. But it's a report where we basically tried to summarise 3.5 years worth of work. There's a whole section about lessons in kind of innovating at the edge, lessons in kind of trying to push charities coming up with new ideas. There's whole lessons in how charities can create and invest in startups, and there's lessons about how you get 12 highly competitive charities to play nicely with each other. Yeah. Some of that work better than others. There's a lot in here there's a lot that we're not saying in there. Anyway, what it basically made really clear to me, and a bunch of you might say this is obvious, you're already there, but what it really made clear to me is what opportunities we have as a sector outside of traditional fundraising, outside of traditional kind of asking for grants, and what it means to kind of think differently about this. But we also realised just how flipping this for, how hard this is to do. And we kind of like managed to create new pathways, new ways for charities to do things that they haven't done before, which is part of what this is all trying to share. I think it's important to take a step outside the sector and go, actually, what this isn't really new. So if you look at financial services, for example, I came from financial services however many years ago. And a lot of financial services innovation 15 years ago was about how do we launch a new credit card? How do we have a loan that's got a slightly longer repayment period, right? It's all very incremental thinking, which I think is kind of a bit similar to where we are now. And if you now look at the financial services sector and the change that's being driven through that, it's fundamentally different. You've got floors and floors in Canary Wharf full of fintech startups being supported by banks to basically change banks, which is amazing when you think of it in terms of you've got Lloyds, you've got Barclays, all these big stellar organisations putting their arms out and going, anyone that's got an idea about how we can change us, come in, come and support us, come and work with us, come and disrupt us. So you get big traditional banks partnering with startups, you get them buying startups, you get them hiring people from startups. And I think that's a really interesting model. Like Lloyds Bank, for example, their core banking system was written in the 1960s, and there's only a handful of people left alive in this country that know how to code in their core banking system. They charge about £4,000 a day. So if you want to retrain, go and do that. And they've been when I was there 15 years ago, they were like, how the hell do we fix this problem? And they couldn't fix this problem because they were stuck in a perpetuating model. Actually, they've partnered with a startup, worked with a startup, they're buying the startup, and that startup is now replacing their entire core banking system. They would have never done that if they tried to do it themselves. But they spotted someone from outside the sector that could do this quicker, faster, cheaper, and they worked with them and bought them in. And for me, that's a really interesting parallel. It's why we don't really do that, but why? Why don't we do that? Because there's loads of opportunity out there. So I think, like, why do I think startups are interesting? I think there's three elements to startups, or three ways about thinking about startups that I think are relevant to us as a sector. They're about how do we create startups, how do we act like startups, and how do we work like startups. So they're taking those in turns, like creating startups. Like we all know income diversification is important. Like how do we create new ways of generating income? And it's like loads of assets and capabilities that we have across the sector that actually we could turn into commercial opportunities. I mean, it's the obvious example, like R&LI, probably know that they sell the spare rooms in their trading centre in Poole. It's apparently the top rated hotel on TripAdvisor in Poole is the R&LI trading hall. They were looking at putting mobile phone, so they have an asset of lifeboat centres all around the country, often in quite rural areas. Rural areas need mobile phone reception, so they look at actually selling the roofs of their lifeboat stations to mobile phone companies for masts, which is an awesome way that you can leverage the assets of a charity in order to generate income. And I think there's really interesting opportunities that we as a sector can do to kind of create these really new ideas and treat them as startups to create new ways of making money. Which that's all well and good. You can think about how you create startups, but then the challenge becomes if we all know we try and do something really big and bold within our organisations, it will probably die a slow, horrible, painful death. Because the fact is that big organisations are built to do what they do really, really efficiently. So big organisations are not built to do really anything new. It's just not how they work. So that's why we need to start thinking about how do we get our organisation to act like startups? How do we start thinking about employing entrepreneurs rather than employing Prince 2 project managers, which is the devil to entrepreneur. And like, how do we reward and incentivise? So if you're an entrepreneur trying to create something new out of nothing, that's hard work, as Phil talked about. You can go and do that with your own startup and earn loads of money. You expect to come into the sector and not have that reward the same way. So how do we reward and incentivise entrepreneurs in a different way that we might reward and incentivise staff? And like, the whole governance is entirely wrong. So when your finance director asks you to produce a 7-year financial forecast for something that you haven't really thought about that much yet, you know just something is entirely screwed up. If you're a startup, if you produce a 7-year financial forecast, you'll be laughed out of the room. So it's like, how do we take those behaviours that work in the world of commercial startups and actually bring that into the sector rather than taking the models that work for big corporates and budgeting? And I think the third part is how do we work with startups? So as I kind of touched on, like charities are not the sole purveyors of doing good. There's a huge groundswell in people at the moment wanting to do things with social purpose, and that is flowing through into a huge rise in social entrepreneurs, where people are actually going, I want to solve some of society's problems, and I'm going to set up a business to do it. But the trouble with these new kind of range of social businesses, these social ventures, we call them, is there's just no money for them. So if you've got a new idea for a social network, because the world needs another one of those, you can go and raise money from angel investors, and then you can go and raise money from VCs, and off you drop, happy as Larry, destroy society. But if you're a social business, you don't have that layer of funding. Because if you're a social business, what you're going to do by definition is sacrifice profit in order to have a social benefit, which basically breaks capitalism, which means we're all fucked. So unless we can reinvent capitalism, we need to look at different ways that we as a sector can support some of these social businesses. But actually, what do we have as a sector? We've got like huge brands where we can give endorsement and trust to these businesses to let them punch way above their weight. We've got like reach into every single community across the country to help these startups get about what they can do. And we've got reserves. There's like 87 billion in reserves in the charity sector. Actually, how do we leverage some of those reserves to do good, but do good through others rather than just trying to do good ourselves? So we're doing a bunch of stuff around this. We've got an incubator which film came from. Is that anyway? I'm going to use a different analogy than was appropriate. We're supporting a bunch of startups to grow at the moment. So we're doing a whole bunch of stuff with this because I think there's loads of people that are talking this game, but I'm not sure there's that much action going on. And so we've actually just gone and done a whole load of stuff. We've created a mini investment fund. So we've actually got 4 charities to pull some money together to start investing in startups, which I just, to be honest, it boggles me that we even got away with doing that. But that for me is an amazing thing that some charities are now experimenting about how they work and support with startups. So that for me is why I think social startups is something really interesting for the sector that we haven't quite got there yet, but I think there's some really interesting stuff there. So I can give you a takeaway. It'd be 3 things. Is to go and think about how do you create startups? How do you unlock startups from within your charities? How do you act like a startup? How do you cut through the crap and think, if I was an entrepreneur, I wouldn't stand for any of this. So how do you act like that? And how do you work with startups? So how do you get your organisation to become a network rather than just kind of like a silo within the ecosystem? That's it. Just do that and everything's fine. Thanks.